Hello, and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the US Census. I might talk to you about the UK Census in some videos in the next week or so because there's been some really interesting data coming out of the 2020 census. I know it's 2023, but it takes a long time to analyze all the data that comes out from 70 odd million people or regarding that many people. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? Well, the question is, why doesn't the US Census ask about religious identity? Uh, as analysis, as I say, from the data from the 2020 UK census filters into the public domain, we are starting to find out a lot about the religious makeup of the population in UK. However, the US census does not ask questions pertaining to religion. There's a really big difference there. And only about a quarter of the US population appears to know this. As a Pew Research Center here says, census forms in the US don't ask about religion, but relatively few US adults, 25%, even know this, according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted shortly before the census forms were mailed out in 2020. Now, in the mid to late 1950s, his Census Bureau asked, this is in the US, asked a question on religious affiliation ahead of the 1960 census. One of the worries at the time was that such questioning would challenge the separation of church and state. The director of the Bureau at the time felt that a question on religion wouldn't threaten the enshrined notion. A voluntary question to 431 Milwaukee households saw only three declining to answer. So in the 1950s, in 1957, the question was broadened to 40,000 households, but concerns were raised, including some religious groups that had experienced persecution. Though the question was not included in the 1960 census, the data from 1957 was published. There were 35,000 responses, of which two-thirds of people aged 14 and older identified as Protestant, about a quarter declared themselves as Catholic, and just over 3% were Jewish. In total, 96% reported an affiliation, while 2.7% reported no affiliation, and 1% did not answer. And that's interesting data nonetheless. So that is 96% reporting an affiliation and 2.7% reported no religion. That's 1957. We're now in 2023. And the minimum statistics really that are uh, estimated for the US population are so 25% plus are religious nuns, not affiliated. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are like atheists or agnostics. They might just be religious but not affiliated with a religion. So it's quite difficult to parse that out. But at the very least, I would say 25% are non-religious of the US population, and arguably much more. Um, During the next 2 decades, there was some debate about including the question until it was decided in 1976 that there would be no religion question in the 1980 census. The census's bureau director, Vincent P. Baraba, declared that, quote, asking such a question in a decennial census, so that's a decade census, in which replies are mandatory, would appear to infringe upon the traditional separation of church and state. Regardless of whether this perception is legally sound, controversy on this very sensitive issue could affect public cooperation in the census and thus jeopardize the success of the census. So you can see that for him, at least, this was a big issue with the separation of church and state when you've got a mandatory question being asked. Later that year, Congress formally prohibited the census from asking a question about religious beliefs, quote, religious beliefs, or quote, membership of a religious body, given that this was something that citizens were legally required to complete. The issue of church and state separation is seen as the most common criticism of including such a question, with others thinking the question would deter respondents from filling out their forms. Response rate, remember, in censuses is a crucial metric to consider. So if you're going to do things that are going to mean people are less likely to fill out the census, it's really counterproductive. You want as much response as you could possibly get. So they shied away from such controversial or what were deemed by at least some, as controversial questions. In a paper in a Journal of American History, Kevin Schultz found the following. To American Jews, the proposal seemed a clear violation of the separation between church and state that, in the shadow of the Holocaust, appeared a frightening means of centralized control. To Catholics, the proposal's success would have achieved a long desired objective, and so the Catholic Church in America threw all its institutional weight behind the measure. To most Protestants, the issue was less contentious, perhaps because it was also new. In the 1957 words of the Christian Century, the non denominational voice of the Protestant establishment, because, quote, religious affiliation has become hardly more than a matter of sociological identification in America, close quotes, many Protestants were hard put to understand all the fuss about just, quote, another automatized item punched on an IBM card, close quote. But there they were, three sides embroiled in a 2 year debate about whether the federal government should put a question about religion on the United States Census of 1960. This is a shame because the data would be a fascinating insight into the religious or non religious landscape in the US. Instead, this has fallen to other organizations such as the Pew Research Center that I've just shown you previously, Gallup, and the NORC, based at the University of Chicago. So, with modeling to suggest that Christianity will fall to below 50% of the US population in the coming decades, these are statistics that many demographers will be keeping a close eye on, not least in terms of the intersection with politics. But I just think it's a big shame they don't have this data on the census. We do in the UK. Some call it a bit of a problematic question in the way it is phrased. And in fact, it would lead to there being an undercounting of the non religious in the UK. But even the British Attitudes Survey, which is different from the census, suggests that at least 52%, I think, was the last um, bit of data, are non religious in the UK. And that is a massive uh, difference between the UK and the US, but it just helps to understand that if we can have the data in the first place, if we had good census data about the religious landscape, about the demographics of religious belief, then that would be really, really useful. But we don't yet have it. I said we, Americans don't yet have it. In the UK, hey, we do. And as I say, I will talk about that in a future video. Anyway, I just thought that as a little dip of the toes into the waters of the US Census. Hopefully it's interesting for you. Just a short video. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.